There's a rumbling groan down below. There's a big dark town. It's a place that I found. There's a world going on underground. Tom Waits. Part 2. Below. 10. Tabitha woke up. At least she thought she woke up. It was difficult to tell. Her mind was murky, her muscles were sore, and the darkness that surrounded her was so total and all-consuming that it was difficult for her to know where the space around her ended and her body began. Were it not for the stream of adrenaline that was coursing throughout her veins, she might have evaporated, lost herself completely. Instead, it was like her blood was jet fuel screaming, "Good goddamn morning, Tabitha Moss!" She jolted upright. The boat she was in rocked back and forth. So, she was in a boat. She didn't know that before, but she knew it now. Her balance floundered as the wake around her swelled. She nestled in tighter between the small craft's wooden ribs. She heard the waves lapping against its hollow sides, felt the warm, misty spray as they broke against the hull. All that, and yet she couldn't see them, couldn't see anything, couldn't see the water, but she knew it was there, knew it was all around her, on all sides, as big as an ocean. She could feel its bigness. A groan suddenly cut through the blackness. Tabitha clutched the edges of her rowboat and listened. Phlegmy lungs inhaled and exhaled slowly, almost a snore, like a katydid in the night. And then she could smell him, his night sweat, that vile scent he would carry into their bed, wafting across the endless tide. "Harrison?" Tabitha said. "Harrison, is that you?" Tabitha? He said. "Shh! Keep your voice down," she said. "What? Why?" There was a pause. "Huh? I don't know why," she replied, no longer whispering. "Never mind, I guess." "What happened?" he said. "What do you mean, what happened?" she said. "You tell me." She heard him sitting up, moving around. He was not in her boat, but he was nearby, somewhere out there, she presumed, in a vessel of his own. Her own boat rocked softly, and the water around them was mostly calm. "Where are we?" she asked. "It's really dark in here," he replied. "It's pitch black. I can't see a goddamn thing. And it's really quiet, too. Are you ignoring my question? I mean, like, really quiet." He fell silent. Tabitha couldn't even hear him breathe anymore. And then he shouted, "I don't hear them!" And his voice might as well have been a bomb going off, or how much it startled his wife. "Jesus, she almost gave me a heart attack. What are you talking about?" "The voices," he said. "The ones in my head, I don't hear them anymore. The voices are gone." "I don't care about that. Where the hell are we, Harrison?" "Tabs, you really don't remember? We're in the hole. Everything was falling apart. We both leapt into the hole." They lapsed back into silence. "Are you there?" Harrison asked. "What the fuck?" Tabitha screamed loud enough to send ripples across the surface of the water. You could hear tiny waves flipping against each other, hear the creak and groan of their rocking dinghies. And then there was something else in the water, too. Something splashing in the distance, slowly coming their way. "Hey, calm down. Do you hear that? What is that? What is that sound?" "Calm down! Calm down! Are you kidding me?" "Just saying be careful, okay? We don't know what's out there." "Careful?" she scoffed. "You're telling me to be careful? That's rich. That's a fucking laugh, right, Harrison? Careful if you destroyed the whole yard, destroyed the entire neighborhood, destroyed everything we had. with that stupid fucking goddamn hole. Don't even start on me with this shit right now, Tabitha. He said, I didn't destroy anything, okay? You saw it yourself. The ground just collapsed in on itself. It was like the hole reached up and yanked itself away from us. You were the one who was digging it, she shouted into the blackness. The splash in the distance was getting closer now. Their boats both pitched, up and down, side to side. It was big, whatever it was, and it was moving their direction. You lost your fucking mind. You cut off your hands, for Christ's sake. You're the one who decided to go sifting through the dirt. I didn't ask for any of this, Harry. I didn't want to come down here. Down here was the only place left to go, he shouted back. If I hadn't pulled you down into the hole, who knows what would have happened? You could have been trapped in the rubble of our house. It could have collapsed all around you if you crucified to the ground like pieces of plywood, driven through your limbs like nails, laying there like a martyr, your shitty refusal to move. Oh yeah, well maybe I would have been fine. It would have been your head that would have been crushed, Tabitha said. Splattered by your 2x4 as the walls caved in around you. Brains like a Pollock painted over the kitchen floor. I would have taken your linoleum-splattered brains and sold them in a museum. People would have called me a genius, a goddamn art prodigy. I would have moved to the city and met a handsome European in his late 20s, and I would have let him fuck me in an alley behind a Chinese restaurant near the dumpster, when the cats and the rats I quivered and came. I would have forgotten your name forever. The splashing grew louder. The boats rocked harder. You could have been struck by a support beam right in your stomach, Harrison gleefully said. Driven like a battering ram into that paunchy belly of yours. You'd have puked up your guts, intestines dribbling out of your mouth like regurgitated scrambled eggs. You would have died from the impact, though. That'd be too easy. You would have been trapped beneath the debris, face down in a puddle of your slop, forced to your own guts, eating your own half-digested shit over and over and over again until malnutrition finally overcame you. Splashing so intense, Tabitha had to shout as loud as she could. You could have fucking died a decade ago, long before you ever got here. I fantasized about so many times. You have no idea what you would look like in your coffin, all calm and cold and blue. I paint that spare room the same shade of blue as your dead face. Or even further back, you could have died before you met me. You could have saved me the pain of having to know you in the first place, to live with you, the pain of having to fall in love. God damn it, we're ever in love, Harry. It's the end result. Is love like everything else in this godforsaken universe, a seed that blossoms only to wither and rot? Wait, said Harrison, his voice suddenly falling flat, grave. Wait, what? Said Tabitha. Do you hear that? Hear what? The splashing from before that was getting louder. No, I don't hear anything. Me neither. Where'd it go? The splashing had completely disappeared, and the silence that replaced it was eerie. The kind of silence that seemed to not be only absent of sound, but absorb it. Had they kept screaming, the silence would have sucked it all up anyway. Are we safe? Tabitha quietly asked. Before Harrison had a chance to answer, the water beneath his boat suddenly exploded upward. It was as if a landmine had gone off. Tabitha fell backwards, landing hard on her back on the bottom of the raft. She yelped for oxygen out of her lungs. Pain, like 1,000 snake bites, shot up her spine. The splashing was back, and now it was deafening. It filled up the air, thicker than the blackness itself. No! She heard Harrison weakly scream, his voice almost consumed by the surrounding noise. A monstrous growl, wood beams splintered as his boat cracked in half, his body hitting the water, immediately blending in with the rest of the commotion, just another plink in the torrent of plinks. Harrison? Tabitha shouted. Harrison, what's out there? First he couldn't answer. Liquid had filled up his lungs, and the thing that had torn his rowboat apart was circling him, its tail slapping violently as it cut through the black water. Tabitha could hear it as it orbited her boat, too, moving in a figure eight. Tabs! He gasped as he bobbed up and down. Help me! Where are you? The shovel and rake! I can't swim with these hands! The creature bellowed, deep in foreboding. I can't, she said, hugging her legs and on in the bottom of her rowboat. I can't see anything. I can't breathe. Tabitha closed her eyes and exhaled. Her body felt incandescent, full of the wrong kind of energy, like she'd swallowed a dozen light bulbs, glass and all. She felt like a transformer ready to explode. Harrison? He didn't reply. He couldn't. His head was below the surface. The thing in the darkness went under two after him, falling quiet as it cut through the water like the rudder of a ship. Harrison? Tabitha said again. Silence and darkness so pervasive it was as if nothingness was all there ever was. Terrified and empty, helpless and alone. How many times when she was laying in bed at night had she wished this fate in her husband, fantasized about violence on him as if he was a goddamn cartoon character, explode him with a stick of dynamite, run him over a train, drop a wrought iron anvil into an unsuspecting head, whatever it took to get rid of him. But he'd always be back in the next scene. That's how cartoons worked. He'd always be okay. But now he was gone. For real. And she was alone. Still, this is what she wanted, wasn't it? This was all his fault, after all, not hers. She was blameless. She was an angel. He dragged her into this hole. She didn't make him dig it. Right? Right? God damn it, she moaned to herself. And then she leapt out of the boat into the water. Only it wasn't water she landed in. What was it? It was liquid for sure, and it was wet. It was water-ish, but heavier, more viscous, stickier. It was like warm and syrupy, and it was hard to move through, but she windmilled her arms in wide, lopping circles and swam towards where she had heard her husband dip under. And then she felt it brush against her leg. This creature, this sea monster, whatever it was. It brushed up against her skin. She could feel its bumpy scales, slightly cooler than the ocean which they swam. There was a give to it, like pushing on an inflated balloon. And the thing was long, like really long. It touched her and kept touching her as it dove down, down, down into the brine, touching her still. It must have been 60 feet. If she were sober enough to fathom a guess, but as it were, the thing seemed to go on forever. Tabitha wanted to cry, but the rusty syrup caked up her eyes and filled her nose and mouth. The taste of metal, like sucking on a penny, that copper sting she could feel in her teeth. She breathed in, deep, filling up her lungs with as much air as she could. And then she dove under too. Were this book adapted into a screenplay, and were that screenplay turned to a movie, and were you in the theater watching that movie right now, this scene would play out as thus. The screen would be black. There would be no sound. You'd be sitting in your chair in the center of the back row, shifting around awkwardly in your padded seat, wondering just how long this blank screen was going to last. As it turns out, it's going to last a really long time, because the longer the filmmakers forced you to look at it, the more uncomfortable you became. And that was the exact motion that they and I were going for. So this vague sort of discomfort settles around you like that mist around a coral town, and now you're starting to realize just how peculiar this whole situation is. Not just the soundless black celluloid flittering by in front of you, but to be here, in this room, with all these other people around you, these strangers. How did you get here? And now you don't even want to breathe because your freight's going to be too loud. And everyone's going to turn around and give you that, "How dare you ruin this dramatic sounds by breathing so loudly?" As Tabitha went under the water, it felt exactly like that. Except in the book version, it lasted longer than it would on screen. It lasted for the longest amount of time you could possibly conceive of. This isn't a movie, and the length of time that passed here is completely up to you and your imagination. How deep does it go? If you imagine her to the water for 5,000 years, then she was under there for 5,000 years. It was for the rest of eternity. She was under until eternity passed. And then, after that interminable amount of time later, she emerged. Tabitha breached the surface like a buoy in a storm, screaming, gasping, greedily pulling air into her lungs. And Harrison was in her arms, limp, not breathing. Up ahead there was a light. The first light that she had seen since they woke up in this ocean, at the bottom of the hole. It didn't shine like headlights or flicker like a candle. It was subtle and soft, illuminating a ceiling high overhead along thick, wet ridges. This was no dawn. This was a light from below. And the water stirred. Like a whirlpool, the water stirred. The sea creature was beneath her now. She thought she felt it like a phantom, brushing against the bottoms of her feet, over and over, teasing its arrival, hinting at something the way a stiff breeze might portend a coming storm. It teased until the thing actually brushed against her feet, firm and fast and very, very real. Its back bucked up out of the water, capsizing her boat. The dinghy went stern up, then sank straight to the bottom as fast as a boulder. There was nothing for her to grab onto, nothing left afloat. Tabitha wrapped her arm around her husband tighter, locking her fingers around the front of his chest though she could barely stay above the surface herself, and she swam. In the low light she could make out the shape of the beast, cylindrical like a tube, with one end slightly fatter than the other. For its size it moved with grace, slick and eel-like, cutting quickly towards her and her unconscious husband. Tabitha paddled furiously, kicking, fighting to move forward. Her husband was like an anchor fixed to her side. The monster getting closer, and even closer. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if there was anywhere left to go. The beast behind her roared. Uncertain light reflected off the water's surface, casting dark shadows across the sanguine sea. She looked behind her and could see the head of it rising up. The mouth opened. There were no teeth inside, but like a suction it pulled ocean to its maw. The roar she had been hearing, she now recognized as the sound of air being torn asunder as it was sucked into this giant worm's pharynx, down its esophagus to the gizzard whirring like a garbage disposal. Up ahead, a luminous shore appeared, not shining, but lit up by an impossible light emanating from nowhere. The light would be a misnomer, and yet it gave shape to the darkness as if it were molding clay. There was shore, she could see it. And then she looked down. This water, this liquid she was swimming in, it was not water at all. It was blood. An ocean of blood. She reached the bank on a whiff of viscera, guts and slime and chum soaking through her clothes. She and Harrison washed up on the beach like whales. She sputtered as she lay him on his back beneath her. Gore splashed at their feet. The worm behind them rose up, a living pipe of intestine, a fleshy skyscraper just inches from the roof of this quivering cave. "Wake up!" she said to her comatose husband, shaking him by the shoulders, slapping him in the face. "God damn, Harry, you moron! Wake the fuck up!" The Harry started forward. The worm started forward like a tree, falling. Slowly at first, letting gravity do most of the work. Its mouth open, its stomach hungry, digestive juices sloshing, dripping, grinding. "Harry!" she cried, shaking him so hard now his head slammed against the ground. "Fuck you for doing this to me!" she screamed to her husband and the worm and existence in general. "Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you!" Lips of the worm closing around them, and then, said a groggy Harrison Moss, his eyes fluttering open. Tabitha let a relieved sigh, which barely escaped from her parted lips before it got tangled up in a conflicted sigh. The full range of human emotions lay trapped on her face like flies in a spider web. She was happy and angry and sad in equal measures. And then the fear, oh yes, the fear. The fear took over. She screamed, remembering the giant worm behind them, hungry mouth open as wide as a planet about to swallow them both. But then she turned and looked, and the monster was gone, completely vanished with no trace, save for the sound of small ripples of blood lapping against the banks on which they lay. 11. It wasn't exactly a sun, and it wasn't exactly a sky, but it was light nonetheless, and it filled up the air above like the ceiling of this cave was the horizon at dusk. The surrounding walls were so high and wide that they didn't appear to be walls at all. It was like a cloudy evening, orange and pink and dark in places, where the shadows of night butted up against each other. But the overall color was calm, and the cave felt no more like a cave than the sky around the earth felt like a glass dome. They walked away from the ocean slowly, across the beach like zombies, like lost little children. The ground crunched beneath their feet. "Where are we going?" Tabitha asked without looking up. "Forward," Harrison replied, and forward they went. They left footprints across the powdery white grain like they were slogging across the surface of the moon. Tabitha stopped and reached down, scooping up a handful of it. She let it run through her fingers like an hourglass. "This isn't sand," she said. "No," Harrison agreed, inspecting it closer himself. "It's bone." "Bone dust?" "The water appears to be blood, and the land is made of bones," he nodded. "But why?" asked Tabitha. "I don't know," Harrison replied. "It's like they've been digested." "Shoot up and spit out," she said. "Probably by that sea worm thing." "I guess not everyone makes it out of that ocean alive." And they continued on. The further from the shore they got, the bigger the bone fragments became. Granules became barbed chunks, before the two of them found themselves surrounded by femurs and skulls festooned about. Complete skeletons stacked in piles, or sprawled on top of one another like they had died, rotted, and were vulture-picked clean as they attempted to claw away. The land descended along a gradual slope. The ocean rested above the beach, defying gravity in an impossible way. The blood should have run downward, but it didn't. The hill followed forward towards a singular point, at least a mile away, still, but this cave was not endless. Tabitha squirmed. It appeared to be some kind of flat surface. Perhaps there was a way out, cut into the rock. It was too far away for them to make out much detail, but barring the firelicks of nearby torches, regardless, from here on out, it was the only way to go. 12. Tabitha and Harrison slowly trudged through dust and bone, the skeletons getting more and more complete as they went. Some had random bits of flesh still attached, chunks of red meat wrapped around them like an unfinished steak. Others were fresher and didn't appear injured at all, aside from a few swollen purple cuts and distended bruises. A little bit of makeup and they'd be coffin ready. It looked like they were sleeping. And then, just a little bit further down from that, the bodies stopped being dead at all. They were awake, alive, or rather, alive-ish. Harrison and Tabitha walked on top of living people, packed so tightly they become meshed, as if they were one giant field of skin melded into each other, a carpet of flesh. Fingers sprang up like saplings, hair like patches of overgrown grass, worms wriggled in and out of nostril holes. The eyes under their feet watched the two of them disapprovingly. Mouths gurgled incoherently. "They're people," Tabitha said. "Just regular people, sown the landscape." A tongue came out of the mouth and licked at her feet. "Are they dead?" she asked. "Some of them appear to be," he replied. "Can we help them?" "I think it's too late." The smell was horrendous. It was warm and wet and everywhere, and then they couldn't walk forward any further because they'd arrived at the bottom of the hill, at a wall. The wall spread out like wings from one horizon to the next. A rampart so high that it was impossible to see past it. Along the top, torches burned. Halos of orange light melted down the battlement. The glow of the fire mixed with the glow of the cave itself. The two lights smeared together like paint on a palette. "Oh man, my stomach still hurts," said Harrison, pulling a handful of leaves out of his mouth and tossing them aside. The sweat in his forehead was tinted green. And then there was a gate, a towering gate, arched like the one that held back Kong on Skull Island. It went up so high that it touched the top of the cave, was built into it. The two of them stepped up to it and stopped. Harrison tried the handle, but it didn't budge. "We can't go any further," he said. "It's sealed shut." Tabitha pounded her fist against the door. It echoed through the chamber, the sounds bouncing around before fading away behind them like mocking laughter. She pounded again and again and again until her fist hurt. Not even a rattle from beyond the gate. Her knocking was answered by nothing. She let her hand fall against the wood, breathing hard, exhausted. "Tabitha," Harrison said softly, reaching out before realizing his hand was still a shovel and pulling it back away. She turned to him. Tears filled her eyes. "I don't want to be with you anymore," she said. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "What?" "I don't want to be with you," she said again, this time more definitely. "This isn't what I signed up for. I don't want to be in this marriage anymore." "I know," he solemnly said, "but this isn't a mistake. It can't be a mistake. We're not down here by accident. The voices called out for you and I. This was going to happen to us sooner or later." "They called out to you, Harrison. I didn't hear anything," she said. "Now, how do we get this door open? How do we get back to the surface? How do we get out of here?" The ground gave right away, right beneath us. It fell through and we fell through it. Tabitha pushed against the giant gate, inspected its hinges, searched in vain for some kind of release mechanism. "Locked. Solid. Can we smash through this?" she asked. "We deserve this," he said. "Can't you see that? We deserve to be buried alive." She turned around and glared at him. Silence followed, and suddenly the cave seemed too small, like it could barely fit the two of them. "What were you supposed to do?" Tabitha asked. First he didn't answer. He looked down at his mutant hands and then raised back his gaze, locking eyes with his wearied wife. I don't know anymore," he finally said. And as if he had just spoken the magic word like, "Open sesame," the torch flames flickered and the gate creaked. It split down the middle, and the two doors parted. 13. Harrison and Tabitha Moss passed through the entrance, unsure of who or what to expect on the other side. They found themselves on a cobblestone street in the middle of a night, somewhere in the perimeter of an unfamiliar city. Jagged apartment buildings sat on either side of them, decaying and baroque, unevenly placed on like teeth in a neglected mouth. These buildings lined the intersecting avenues, creating somewhat of a tunnel effect, blocking most of their periphery. Sallow light filled the windows of some of the apartments. There were sounds coming from inside, raspy and rustling, not voices in the traditional sense, but whispers nonetheless, and a breeze that was not uninviting, causing summertime curtains to dance their way into the adjacent alleys. The gate slowly shut behind them and locked itself with a loud, metallic clank. The noise was so jarring against the hushed murmur coming from the nearby buildings that a spooked Tabitha quickly spun around her heel to greet it. There she saw no door at all. It was sealed up, the opening waxed over like an old scar, like the vagina she once had. The wall behind them stretched up until it blended into the evening sky, spilling upward to become more than just wall. She ran her hand against it, smooth, cold, impassable. Is this some sort of second cave they were in? A cave within a cave? Was the last room just an antechamber? It sure seemed that way, but how could this second cave be bigger than the one that surrounded it? Were they still trapped? There didn't appear to be any obvious way to egress, and yet they didn't really feel trapped at all. The unfamiliar city was wide open in front of them, as big as any city they'd ever known. They had gone down the hole, hadn't they? They were still inside the earth, weren't they? They were here in this kingdom of bone and dirt, and so Tabitha wondered, what was this moon that shone above them? Because it was there, high above, white and brown, like the moon she thought she knew. Was this a false moon? A pseudo-moon? A ball of pale light masquerading as a moon? Does this impostor even know what it took to be a moon? Did it know what a moon means when it rises up full and pregnant? Did it know how to steer ships? For that matter, did Tabitha know what a moon means? Did Harrison? Do you? Up ahead, a vision of downtown faded into view. Skyscrapers lined up, lit up, squares of concrete against the ashen horizon. But more than just the buildings themselves, there also appeared to be a volcano sticking up in the center of the metropolis, steep on the sides yet shorn on the top. It dwarfed the meager structures built around it by hundreds of feet. It was almost as if the city itself were built in reverence of this massive mountain, like the buildings were just worshippers genuflecting at its feet. From the upper basin of the volcano there flickered an orange light, a firelight. This appeared to be what illuminated the city and refracted off the moon. Steam rose from the crater in puffs, creating an ambient fog that hung over the cityscape like a wedding veil. This was not a skyline either of them recognized. This wasn't Albany or Dayton. This wasn't LA or Chicago or San Antonio, Texas. This certainly wasn't motherfucking New York City. They were somewhere else entirely. I get a feeling we're not in Texas anymore, said Harrison. Tabitha whipped her head around and sneered at him. Why would you say that? Huh? That stupid cliched phrase about Kansas, she said. That thing from the Wizard of Oz. Jeez, I don't know, Harrison shrugged. Thought that was what people were supposed to say in situations like this. Tabitha sighed and walked down the road. Whoa, wait, Harrison said. Where are you going? Where else would I be going, Harry? I'm getting out of this fucking hole. I'm gonna find a way back up. I'm gonna go home. He took a few steps after her. Hey, no, you can't do that. Like hell I can't. Tabitha, we don't know where we are. We don't even know where home is. It's certainly not here, she said. They stood there staring at each other for a moment, like gunfighters at high noon, each one waiting for the other to draw their weapon. You know I can't go with you, he eventually said, if you walk away. I don't care. We're down here for a reason. The voices called to us. The shadows beckoned us. Jesus, no more of this mystic bullshit. You're like a broken record. Look, we can either live on the precipice forever in fear of falling over, or we can journey to the bottom of this and find out what it's all about. We're halfway there already. You know as well as I do the story will end at some point, regardless of the paths we choose. So you just gotta stop and ask yourself this one question before it does. Do we have anything to gain by being here, Tabitha? She rolled her eyes. I don't have time for this. We were comfortable until you lost your fucking mind, Harrison. We had a house, a life. It may not have been perfect was ours, and it's all gone now. So I'm not kowtowing to you any longer. I'm not following you around like a lost little puppy. I'm gonna find my own way out of here, then I'm never coming back. Whatever you do is up to you. Well then, he said, pausing for dramatic effect. I guess this is goodbye. She scoffed and shook her tired head. You know that's a cliché thing to say too. And she walked away, leaving Harrison standing there, and the false stars twinkled, and the fake moon shined. 14. She traveled down the road. She didn't have a specific destination in mind, save for the vague notion of the home that had collapsed in their wake as the hole in the backyard swallowed everything up. She certainly hadn't considered how to get out of this place, if there even was a way to get out of this place. The sky was built into the walls like a snow globe, solid rock. That didn't leave her with much hope of escaping anytime soon. The volcano downtown grumbled and hissed, but other than that, the city was eerily quiet. No cars, no bikes, no pedestrians bustling to and fro like they would in the world above. There were streetlights casting yellow pyramids of light down to the pavement, and there was the shade that filled up all the spaces between that, but even in the dark, she didn't see anything out of sorts. Of course, a city street, being as quiet as this was in itself, was already out of sorts. And then she could hear footsteps behind her. Distant at first, but getting closer. 2 footsteps for every one she took, reverberating off the cobblestone sidewalk and the concrete facades of the rotten buildings nearby. Clack, her heels said. Clack, clack, the echo replied as it traveled down the desolate street. Clack, clack, her heels doubled down as she quickened the pace. Clack, 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 the darkness answered back. First it was merely repeating her, parodying her exactly, as echoes often do, a one-sided conversation between her and the wall. Repeating her, the echo was, until it spoke on its own. These were not her footsteps she was hearing. She was being followed. "Harry?" she called out. "Harry, is that you?" The clacking continued, grew more feverish, like a secretary typing on a keyboard, like raindrops falling on a tin roof. Footsteps clacked on the pavement in quick succession, louder and fuller with every passing second. Tabitha froze, eyes darted, and yet she couldn't see anyone. Fear overcame her, set her muscles to stone, her blood to ice. After escaping the worm monster in the ocean of blood with its ravenous maws set to grind her up and deposit her on the seashore with the rest of those hapless corpses, she hadn't the desire nor the strength to keep on running. She didn't ask for this life, and she didn't think it was fair that she had to keep atoning for it. Here she was, lost in a dark city, stalked from the shadows by a clacking whose goal is nebulous at best and homicidal at worst. Then, the thing that was following her came out from a nearby alley, and she saw it. It was a beetle. A massive rhinoceros beetle, the size of a box truck. Its oil-black body glistened like it was wet, reflecting back the low light of the counterfeit moon. Its barbed legs slapped against the street. Clack, clack, clack. Tabitha wanted to recoil, to scream, but she didn't. She didn't even skip a breath. She wasn't afraid at all. It was like her brain glitched and then rebooted itself, its operating system blank, ready to be reprogrammed. Something about this gigantic beetle barreling horn force down the street seemed perfectly natural to her. No more remarkable than a Toyota Corolla. In fact, she was more surprised by the fact that she wasn't surprised that she was by the human-sized worm riding on the beetle's back. The worm pulled back on the beetle's antenna, which acted like a reins, causing it to slow to a trot and eventually stop. Tabitha stood there as the creature slid down the side of the beetle, leaving a trail of slime behind him, and settled there before her. He was a very handsome worm. Wait, what? Did Tabitha really just use the word handsome to describe a worm? She tried to feel terror, wished to be repulsed, but those emotions just weren't there. The worm man had a tuft of black hair, slicked back into a pompadour like a prince in a Disney cartoon. Other than that, there was no way to determine its top from its bottom, as he was just a tube of loosely connected pink flesh. He slunk up to her with confidence, as if he didn't know he was a worm at all. He coiled up, his body pulsating. He flexed. She felt her skin become flush. She was blushing. "Can you make it home?" she asked the worm man. He didn't say anything back to her. He couldn't. He had no voice box in which to speak, but somewhere, deep inside her head, she knew this worm man was answering her. Yes! He flattened out the top part of his body and motioned for her to climb with him onto the back of the beetle. She awkwardly tried to bring a foot up onto the scarab's smooth shell, but couldn't find a stirrup. The worm man tossed back his hair and slid underneath her, bucking his back up, easily lifting her leg with the bulk of his body. She was able to grab onto one of the ridges that ran along the giant insect's spine and pull herself the rest of the way. She sat and baited like a mahout on an elephant. The worm man slithered up behind her, his body sticky with mucus. He wrapped the front part of himself around the beetle's antenna and gave it a tug. It continued down the street as had before. Clack, clack, clack. 15. Did the sun rise underground? There was certainly a moon, as already established, a big rock jammed into the ceiling, phosphorescent and blue. But if there was no sun, then there was no morning, and if there was no morning, then there was no tomorrow. Under here, the night had usurped the day. Harrison didn't wear a wristwatch. He didn't even have wrists anymore, unless you counted the infective bands of wet flesh that encircled the areas where the tools had replaced his hands. And even then, he might have thrown a watch around it had it not been for the thick white roots growing out of the wounds instead. The roots twisted up and around the stems of his hands, held them in place. He could feel the pressure of the seed growing inside him, pushing out against his skin, looking for places to go. Harrison Moss had no wristwatch, and as such couldn't tell the time proper, but he felt like he had been wandering around this subterranean city for days. Days. Suppose we're going to need a word for that if we're going to stay down here. Occasionally he would spot some sort of insect scuttling by, darting out of an alley, past a streetlight, its shadow stretched out wide and crooked like it was running past a funhouse mirror. In the windows of the apartments where the unintelligible whispering seemed to coalesce into a buzz, the sound of which reminded him of the chop saw running in the shed. He could see the shapes of bugs peeking out, peeking up, regarding him with disdain, earthworms mostly. The population of this place was overwhelmingly of the annelid variety. They were under the dirt, after all, and if any creature held providence over such a place, then these night crawlers were certainly it. He was a stranger in a strange land, the strangest land. The voices had stopped talking to him, though, stopped boring through his thoughts the way a worm would bore through the soil. He should be grateful for that, right? With this newfound lucidity, his hands now seemed almost comical. A shovel and a rake? Come on! It was a truly bizarre thing to do, but the compulsion to dig had been so overwhelming at one point that Harrison thought that was all there was. He was a digging machine, an excavator, a tool himself employed for purposes far grander and far more mysterious than he could ever hope to understand. If you asked a hammer what it thought the meaning of life was, would it be able to answer you? Of course not! How was he supposed to describe that to his beleaguered wife? And yet, now his hole was done. He was left to aimlessly wander this odd city. Even for the difficult sojourn he had steeled himself to go on, he hadn't considered where he would have to go once he got there. Now, were this book one of those contrived kind of novels where the indomitability of the human spirit was the big takeaway in the end, Harrison's inner monologue, as read in the last section above, would have been realizing some cornballism about life, being all about the journey and not the destination or that sort of blah 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 nonsense. Clearly that is not what this book is about. If it were, this story would have ended when the hole in their backyard gave way, and Harrison and Tabitha both fell in, swallowed up and buried by their own hubris, the weight of which was the entire world. They both received their deliciously ironic finale. Roll the credits. The end. Shit, in retrospect, that was probably where this story should have ended. That was a logical explanation and conclusion, after all. A clear and unpretentious metaphor. Poetic, too. What's left to say? What the fuck could possibly happen next? Well, here's what the fuck happened next. Harrison Moss heard music. Yep, music. Low and distant. The bass purring out of an electronic drum beat. It made the world vibrate like the street itself were the string of a harpsichord. Harrison walked towards the sound. It was almost as if he were being beckoned, as if these passing notes could reveal to him his new life's purpose. And perhaps they could. Who am I to say? He tapped his shovel hand against the stem of each of the streetlights as he passed, the metal against metal going ping each time. Ping, ping, ping. For the briefest of moments he thought of Tabitha and how at one point she was the music by which he moved. But this thought was ephemeral. He didn't hold on to it. He didn't even attempt to, as the time for holding on to things had long since expired. He knew that without hands to aid him, holding on to things was now physically impossible. Nonetheless, here was the shape his thoughts of Tabitha took. He remembered how she used to like to dance. They both liked to dance. It was a thing they used to do together when they were younger. He would take her out to a club downtown, and they would sip vodka tonics and laugh and smile and talk about whatever floated through their minds. And they would relinquish themselves to the music and to each other, and the night would blend into this big and beautiful blur, a montage of jubilant and hopeful vignettes, one after another, glued together by feelings of safety and affection. They'd go back to his apartment, their bodies still humming, and have sex in drunken haze. It was magical. Moments like that once seemed so important, so obvious, and oddly enough, so easy to come by. Loving someone else had felt so natural to him then. He didn't even have to think about it. It felt like breathing, automatic and effortless. But love is not a love spring. It's not just there for you to discover like a rowboat in the bloodiest of seas. Their love eventually ran out, ran dry. It didn't last, and neither did the home they built, and neither did his hands. If there was love left to be wrought from this world, his wife would not be the lens through which to look for it. At the end of the road, nestled between two tall apartment buildings, was a warehouse of sorts. Its veneer was squat and plain. Unassuming is the word one could use to describe it. Or it would have been the one word one could use to describe it, had the dance music not been growling from behind the walls. The rows upon rows of windows that lined the top of the building glowed in hues of indigo and pink, not bright colors, but deep, blending in with the brick so that the stone itself seemed to shine. It was a club with no name, a warehouse rave, and in this underground city where it was always night, this was a party that has no end. Outside the front door, insects had gathered. Crickets, termites, cicadas, earwigs, and worms. The worms, up on their haunches, numbered in the hundreds. All of them stand about the height of Harrison himself, waiting in line to enter the building. Harrison passed them. The creatures with black marble eyes looked him with contempt. The blind, eyeless ones did their best to do the same. Unsure of where to go and what to do, bereft of a purpose any loftier than this, he got in line behind them. Arms crossed in front of his chest, he shifted uncomfortably as the insects around him clicked and chirped. He was pretty sure they were communicating to each other. Or maybe they weren't. To him, they were just noises. Horrible noises. The music was good, though. It was just the kind of music Tabitha used to listen to. Identical, in fact. And then, interrupting the thoughts of Tabitha that once again flittered through his head, he noticed a lady worm sasaying past the line with a nod and a wiggle. There was no distinguishing mark to note her gender, of course, but he could just tell. The way her body curved, genteel and soft, a parabola of the most sensual and feminine design. He felt his blood quicken, force-feeding more oxygen to the sprouting seed within him. Leaves unfurled from his nostrils and he exhaled them out. Was she coming his way? Harrison let a smile slip across his lips as she slid up right next to him. He ran his raked hand through his hair. "What's inside this building?" he asked, even though he already knew. She coiled down, twisted her body in a loop around his arm as if she was his red carpet escort, and gave him a little tug. He seemed confused at first, but his feet firmly planted on the ground. But she tugged again, and soon he relinquished, let her lead him on. They moved slowly. She wasn't rushing him. They walked forward along the side of the line. He ignored the jealous stares from the impatiently waiting insects. When they arrived at the front, a large fat beetle guarded the door. They stopped. The music was louder here as it spilled through the opening. He looked them over skeptically. Harrison gulped and raised his eyebrows. The worm woman cocked her head in a reprimanding manner. The beetle slid aside and let the two of them pass through the entrance into the club. 16. The music was so loud it sounded like it was underwater. The bass was more of a feeling than actual tone. Decibels bellowing either so low or so high they merely flirted with the edge of Harrison's perception. The whole building shook. The bugs inside it shook. Every molecule that made up Harrison's body shook too. It was a party. Harrison smiled as the worm woman led him in further, towards the dance floor. They found a spot, nestled between the moist, cold bodies of the other insects. Harrison and the worm woman danced. She brushed his rake hand along the curve of her back as she ground up against him in time to the beat. She could feel the prongs scraping against her mucousy skin. He could feel the clammy heat radiating from her sticky body. They were the only two creatures in this building who appeared to be warm. Wait, are worms capable of generating heat? How does that even work? Don't Google the answer, it'll ruin the mystery. This worm woman was certainly generating heat, that's all that matters. This whole thing, it felt like a dream. Something about this reminded Harrison of the night he woke up and replaced his hands with gardening tools. It all seemed so far away to him now, as if it happened to someone else, and he only watched. The screech of the rusty saw, the sensation of his hands getting chopped into little pieces. Did it even hurt? And even before that, there was the afternoon prior. Harrison in the backyard on his hands and knees, eating that seed from the spleen fruit tree. Swallowing it down, letting it grow. Why did he eat that disgusting seed anyway? There had to be a reason, right? It was like it was someone else's memory trapped in his head, like a photo album on a shelf that belonged to some neighbor he never met. The beat sped up, double-timed, matching the tempo of his ever-accelerating heart. He continued to move and sweat the dance floor. Oh, but how he loved it. In that moment he surrendered himself completely, his feet unencumbered, his spirit free. A stupid smile on his stupid face, looking completely stupid, and he danced stupidly in this den of bugs. This must have been why he dug the hole. This must have been what he was looking for. And there, with the worm in front of him, now rubbing her backside up and down his torso, seductive and obscene. She was a monster. Of course she was a monster, but he couldn't deny his attraction to her. He could feel it inside him, something growing, spreading, pushing against the inside of his skin, trying to claw its way out. What was he then, if not a monster too? She turned to face him, her wicked curves beguiling as the beat of the music itself. He threw his head back, bellowed, allowed her to rub him, tease him, arouse him, awaken him, and after an eternal amount of time later, when he opened his eyes again, he saw that they were only two still dancing. That's odd, he thought. The bass drums still crashed like tectonic plates. The music got swimmier. And then it wasn't music at all, but a sustained hum. A protracted growl, almost seismic, as if it buried itself deep into Harrison's marrow. This wasn't a song he heard, but a roar he felt from within. They had been given a birth, a circle to move in all their own, and every other bug in the club was watching them. Hundreds of eyeballs all pointed their way. Dark clouds, beneath glass domes, jammed into skulls of nightmare shapes. These were the eyes of salicious and alien voyeurs, and the insects were ready for a show. Harrison's dancing slowed, though. The worm woman kept whipping around her body like a lasso. Wait, what's happening? He said, though he might as well have not said anything at all, because if these insects understood English, and he had seen no indication to suggest that they could, they wouldn't be able to hear him anyway. The worm woman jerked her head around, a tremble of the short bristles that lined her spine, her sides, as she wrapped the lower half of her body around Harrison's feet, encircling him 2 or 3 times, up his body and around his chest. Wait a minute. I know you, he said to her again, aloud, in a room full of deaf ears. I've seen you before. That night, the night I started to dig, you were there. In the shadows, in and out of my perception like a ghost. You were in my house, watching me. You had something to do with this, didn't you? Now panicked. What are you? What is happening here? What have you brought me? And then she squeezed. The breath shot right out of his mouth as she increased the pressure on his lungs, squeezed tighter. His knees buckled and he toppled to the ground. She twisted up around his hands now, pinning the shovel and rake to the dirt floor. He tried to thrash, to kick free and run, but it was useless. He couldn't escape and he knew it. "What are you doing?" he muttered. She pushed him down harder, laying her thick, sausage-like body against his face, so he had to turn his head sideways to keep from suffocating completely. She then stretched herself out as far as she could stretch, thinning into a long tube the thickness of a cucumber, her entire body growing until she is 25, then 30, then 35 feet from end to end. Living spaghetti. She then took the tip of what would be her head, bulbed it up like an angry fist, and pushed her way past Harrison's lips, down his throat, deep inside, into his body. 17. Somewhere else, on the opposite end of the city, after what seemed like a week of endless travel, though, again, without the sunrise-sunset cycle it was hard to tell, a beetle the size of a box truck was skittering its way down a suburban street. Tabitha rode on its back. The worm man sat in front of her. She wrapped her arms around the tube of his body. His skin was moist. She rested her cheek against his backside and felt safe. The worm man steered the beetle around a corner, and as the street of them flattened out, Tabitha could see it terminated a few houses ahead of her, in a cul-de-sac, a dead end. The trees that lined the sidewalk here were barren, thin wooden branches, leafless and naked. They looked like calcium-starved bones, like they were skeletons clawing for the ceiling, but still. Something about all this seemed very familiar, and Tabitha couldn't quite shake the feeling of déjà vu until she looked at the street sign identifying the road they were traveling down. It was falling over, covered in grime and hard to read, but she only had a glimpse it in part to know exactly what it said. Sycamore Lane. This was her street. And that decaying building up ahead, that was her house. The worm man pulled the beetle into the driveway and slid down. He extended his body sideways to give Tabitha something to hold on to as she made her way down too. He even opened the door and let her into the house. He was a courteous worm. She stepped through the entryway into the foyer. It looked like her home inside. It was unmistakable. The architecture, the layout, even the furniture and decorations were in exactly the same places that Tabitha remembered them. Yet, something was off. Her head swiveled back and forth. Where exactly was she? The entire house, the entire neighborhood, in fact, looked as if it had been abandoned. Then spent the next decade falling further and further into a state of condemnation. Tables and chairs, those seemingly rotten here, were the same table and chairs she'd always known. The couch was a festering lump of soiled cloth. The rooms were gray and cobwebby and quiet, and a thick layer of dirt covered everything. The walls creaked and cracked. The floorboards sighed mournfully under her feet. Tabitha took it all in slowly, bulldozing a little mountain of dust as she ran her finger across the mantel, breathing the sarcophagus air of this dead living room. She came upon a framed photo. The edges of it had been eaten up by time, staining the rest of the picture yellow and brown. It was a wedding photo. Her wedding photo, to be precise. Tabitha in her dress, once white, now jaundiced as the film aged. Harrison standing behind her, tuxedo and tie and suit coat on, but for some reason his face had been obscured. It was as if someone had tried to scrub it out with bleach. A white void in the photo, a hasty smudge. Tabitha and this empty smear of a man, joined in holy matrimony. Till death do they part. So she moved on to the next set of photos. It was them in their first apartment, when they still lived in the city downtown. The place was a dump, roach-infested and full of mold, on the 6th floor of an apartment building that didn't even have an elevator. When they moved in, they had to drag the love seat up the thin, crooked staircase, and it had gotten stuck on the bend on the 3rd floor. They sat there, sweaty and laughing, until the old guy who lived in the door underneath came and helped force it through. His name was Mr. Humboldt. They ate peanut butter sandwiches that night because it was the only food they had. Wasn't that long ago, was it? Those were the honeymoon days, the salad days. But now the photograph paper looked dozens of years older than it actually was. The colors faded, and Harrison's face bleached out. She went through all the pictures in the room, looking at the walls like a patron in a museum. She pulled a crumbling picture album from the bottom shelf of the bookcase and flipped through the pages. It was the same every time. It was gone, scratched out, whitewashed over, like it was being erased. Harrison. She yelled his name out loud to herself, the sound of it like Ajax on her tongue, and then again. Harrison. She did it again and again and again until the word lost all its meaning. Harrison, Harrisan, Herodson, Haremstem, Hardstand. And somewhere in the gray noise of her voice, in the ritualistic chanting of the nonsense word that his name had become, she also lost the image of his face. It was just like in the photos, but now in her mind's eye too, like it got zapped from her memory. Poof, smoke, just like that. He was gone. But it wasn't empty space that replaced him. There was a figure there. Yes, taking up his place in her brain. But the figure was ill-defined. She stood in front of the ash-clogged fireplace and wondered what and who this thing she called her husband was. Her past was so fuzzy. Had he ever been a man? Or was it a worm that had always stood beside her? She crept up the stairs. There she saw their dirty bathroom, their filthy bedroom, the closet full of piles of rubbish. Everything was the same, but corrupted, spoiled. Everything, that is, except the spare room across the hall, the same one Tabitha had attempted to repaint 1,000 times before. That imperfect room. The door to it was closed. Tabitha went to open it, but was greeted instead by the sound of barking metal. She looked down and saw a chain wrapped around the doorknob several times and held in place by a thick padlock. She jerked the door again to make sure it was as locked as it seemed. Sure enough, it didn't budge. "What is this?" she asked the worm man who had stood up next to her. "Why is this door locked? Why can't I go in here?" He ignored her question and instead motioned for her to follow. "This is my house, right?" she said, standing firm. "Doesn't it belong to me? I need to look in there. This was my room. I was decorating when it all fell apart. I need to see it. I need to see what it looks like now. Is it complete?" He pulsated, using his thick body to get in between her and the sealed room, and egged her forward. Chagrined and confused, the conviction in her voice simply melted away without protest as she left the door and followed the worm back down the stairs. Together they passed through the soiled living room, to the equally tainted hall, the besmirched kitchen, and went out into the backyard. And there, under the forever night of this black cave, and the faint crystal moon that oozed pallid light, and the wind that was not wind, behind the house that was an echo of the house she was forced to leave behind, the yard was still intact. It was untouched by it was untouched by a shovel, undug by a rake. There was no hole in it, and next to it, no spleen fruit tree grew. It was a normal yard, just like every other yard in this neighborhood. In an instant, she forgot about the locked room upstairs. She turned to the worm man and smiled as joyful tears ran down her eyes. She couldn't remember the last time she felt this happy. 18. The dress she wore had pictures of sunflowers printed all over it. Yellow petals and skinny green stems against the cerulean fabric that hugged her bosoms and tapered out at her hips. She found it in the bedroom, a welcome change of clothing from the blood-caked outfit she'd been wearing since she pulled herself out of the grisly ocean all those hours, days, months, years ago. She had tried cleaning the house, for a while at least, but it never got any better. She'd sweep up a pile of dust and turn around to find a new layer covering the floor again. She'd dragged the trash can out to the curb, but a garbage truck never came to pick it up. She'd scrubbed the windows, and it would only smear the filth across it in brown arches, like a colorless rainbow plastered against the glass. The water that came out of the sink was black. If she were to switch on the TV, every station would be filled with gray static. But it was safe to say, but it was safe, and it was easy. No one expected anything of her. No one bothered her. And she was happy. I mean, this was what happiness felt like, right? Don't think about it, Tabitha. I mean, what even is happiness anyway? Tabitha, are you listening to me? What's in the spare room? Why is it locked? Her bed was a mound of dirt with a tarp thrown over it. The worm man would sleep under the tarp, and she would sleep on top. And then it was Saturday. And the only reason she was aware it would become Saturday was because the doorbell rang, and when she opened it, Brad and Jennifer Flatley were standing there. "Hey, yo, neighborinos," said Brad. "You guys ready to barbecue or what?" Brad Flatley had no eyes. They had been eaten out of his skull and replaced by black voids. In the hollowed-out sockets, a few small worms still dangled, swinging like miniature pendulums each time Brad moved his head. The same with Jennifer. This eyeless woman sitting next to her groom, her skin emaciated and pruned like it had been sucked dry of all its juices. Starved tendons wrapped around their bird-like bones, held in place by an ashen layer of latex-thin skin. They were covered in welts and pulsating sores, leaking what little fluid had been left to pump through their veins. A pink trail of it dripped from Jennifer's nose. "Pardon me," she said, using the back of her hand to wipe it up. "It's just my brains. They've been liquefied, you know. Eaten digested by all the parasites in my head. Turned to goop." They sat in lawn chairs on the patio in Tabitha's backyard. Big, empty smiles on their gruesome faces. Teeth already having been pushed out of their inky gums. They seemed as lively and enthusiastic as ever, though, despite their physical appearances. Tabitha sat across from the couple, shrunk up in her seat, trying not to get sick from just having to look at them. For his part, the worm man sat there too, complacent and quiet while the neighbors chatted away, reacting the way you'd expect a worm to react to such horrors, which is to say, not reacting at all. Occasionally, he'd shift in his sheet, making a banana-like squish as he did so, but other than that, he remained aloof. "You'd be surprised just how little use you have for your brain once it's mostly gone," Jennifer continued. "Teal started running on my nose and down my face. I hardly ever thought about it at all." "Doesn't it hurt?" "Oh, God, yes!" Jennifer exclaimed. "Pain and excretion never-ending," Brad calmly added. "But you just kind of get used to it. And after a while, it doesn't sting as much. Then after a little more time passes, you don't even notice it anymore. You just go about your day like any other day, and any pain you felt before is just now part of your existence. No more intrusive than a yawn. What more could you ask for, really?" "Salad?" asked Jennifer, offering up a spoonful of wriggling grub from the bowl they had brought over. "No thanks, I'm not hungry," Tabitha said. "Suit yourself," Jennifer replied, dumping the ladle of grubs down her own throat, not even attempting to chew. They climbed up into her head cavity and down into her esophagus. They wriggled out of her ears. They spilled out of the holes in her neck and chest, taking tiny bits of her flesh with them as they fell. Jennifer didn't even notice. "Where are we?" Tabitha asked. "What is this place?" "What do you mean?" said Jennifer. "We're in your backyard." "I know that," said Tabitha, "but where is my backyard? What city is this? How is any of this possible?" "Oh, boy, that's a loaded question. You want to take this one, Brad?" Jennifer asked. "I sure can," her husband cheerfully replied, sliding up in his chair and placing a skeletal hand on Tabitha's knee. paused for a beat before continuing. Who are on the other side? The other side? She said. As above, so below, as within, so without. As the universe, so the soul, he said. What? I didn't come with that quote, mind you, he said. Actually, I found on the internet, on this one website that aggregates famous quotes you can browse through. Pretty rad saying, though, right? And appropriate. Am I dead? Tabitha asked. What? No, not even close, he snickered. Are you dead? Do I look dead? Yes. All right, well, granted, I look dead, but I'm certainly not acting dead, and that's because I'm not. Dead things don't have conversations. They don't go on about moving and talking and smiling and eating in backyard barbecues like this. Don't matter how many bugs they got filling about feasting on them. Dead is dead. If we were dead, if you were dead, there wouldn't be any comeback, Jennifer chimed in. There's no such thing as heaven. Not that should come as a surprise. Mythology might help keep the world glued together upstairs, but you're not going to find any real magic down here. Once the lights go out, there's only darkness left. Tabitha reacted to this as though she just tasted something bitter. There were bodies lining the shore, ground up like sand or sewn up in the landscape like a human blanket. And this giant worm monster. Tabitha, he's right next to you, Jennifer said out of the side of her mouth, motioning Slater to the worm man. No, not him, he said. He's my husband. Brad finished her sentence for her. Her forehead wrinkled up and her nostrils flared out and she exhaled dramatically. It seemed like that was what she was supposed to say, but still it didn't sit right with her. My husband, she said out loud herself. Nah, it definitely didn't sit well. The worm man continued to say nothing. No, she's talking about the big one, Jennifer said. The one outside the city limits, that thing in the ocean of blood. Oh, that worm monster, Brian exclaimed. You're going to have to be a lot more specific going forward, darling. There's a lot of different types of worms. But to answer your question, that's the first trial anyone who makes it down there has to face, and as you saw, the vast majority of people don't escape it. They end up ripped apart and falling back on the shore. More often than not, that means of the terminal variety. And then there's the second trial, said Jennifer. Getting past the gate itself. Getting in the city limits, as you can see by the distinct lack of human beings around. Not too many figure out how to open it. They just stand there like idiots until they melt to the ground. Then they remain there, forever immobilized, forced to watch others step up to the gate and prosper or perish, but unable to intercede. Some people argue that's a fate worse than death. But how did I get it open? Asked Tabitha. The gate. I don't remember how I got it open. That's a good question, said Jennifer. I suspect you had to confront some sort of uncomfortable truth and then, for better or worse, move on. It's kind of how things work down here. Emotional catharsis is the only currency that seems to matter in these parts. Fortunately, most people are too impoverished in that regard, and they don't even realize it's way too late. They don't get anywhere. They're hopeless. So was there a third trial? Said Tabitha after a slight pause. A what? A third trial, Tabitha repeated herself. After this, some other place I need to go, or some other thing I need to do. Is this the end? How should I know? Jennifer said. We made it. We're here, back home on Sycamore Lane. That's all that matters, right, honey? Right, Jen, he said. Honestly, what more could you ask for? And Jen, I am just tickled pink that you're here too, Brad added. We never would have guessed it, but as sure as I breathe, here you are. I'm so confused, said Tabitha, running her fingers through her greasy hair. This is really cute, Jennifer said, giving her husband a sheepish smile. It's like she thinks she's the only person to ever fall down a hole before. Tabitha, you looked in the mirror before, right? Brad said. Huh? Mirror. In the back room? In the bathroom? Or the inside door over in a mall? Yes, I've looked in a mirror. Thing is about mirrors is they only show you things that are there, right? That's how they work. So that reflection you're getting in the world that surrounds you. That's the only thing you're going to find in the mirrors yourself. Flipped around backwards and all the things behind you that you normally wouldn't be able to see when you're facing forward. You're speaking in metaphors, sweetie, Jennifer interjected. Now, people can't handle that. The flip side of where they're supposed to be facing, he continued. And all that shit they left laying in the way behind them, all that shit they were too afraid to confront, it tends to grow bigger and meaner in the darkness. It just grows until it's out of control, and there's no place else left to go. And they're forced to look upon the mess they've created. Head on, they let it tear them up. Tear them into pieces, so to speak. All those fragments of people you've seen on the beach, those are the ones who let the mirror win, who let things in the darkness destroy them. But not you, Jennifer said to Tabitha. You made it home. Is this my home? She mumbled. This is a journey into your set. This is a journey into yourself, said Brad. Even if our love for each other, or lack thereof, was uninspired, it was good enough. We still liked our stupid little house and our stupid little neighborhood. We even liked you guys and the barbecues we had on Saturday nights. That's why we came over. We're having fun. We can have fun again if we pretend. Isn't this fun? Tabitha was silent for a moment, letting all this information sink in. And then she turned back to her gaunt and cadaverous neighbors. She asked them very simply, So what happens next? The Flatleys exchanged a quick glance. What are you talking about? Said Brad. Nothing. This is it. 19. Now, two important things are going to happen over the next few chapters that will alter the course of the rest of this book. Hopefully in ways that you as a reader will find both unpredictable and illuminating, because despite what Brad Flatley just said to Tabitha Moss, this certainly wasn't it. The first important thing that is going to happen is that Tabitha is going to swallow a seed, just like Harrison did all those many pages ago. It's going to go full circle like that. And this will, of course, be the impetus for the second important thing that's going to happen, which is that Tabitha is going to break into the locked spare room upstairs. Once she does that, and once we resolve that horrifying little scene with Harrison the Worm Woman in the nightclub, we'll be ready to barrel full steam into this novel's third act. Imagine that, the third act already. How we get her so fast? Wow, it really went quick. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're still in the backyard, at this barbecue. Brad and Jennifer Flatley sitting opposite Tabitha and the Worm Man. Steam rising from the cricket patties on the grill. Oh yeah, they eat cricket burgers down there. Numb! Mimics the steam rising from the volcano, violently juxtaposed next to the center of downtown. It gurgled and burped as volcanoes tend to do, but Tabitha and her company couldn't hear that from their current location, because Brad, once again, started talking. Hey, what's with the long face, neighbor? He said. Isn't this what you wanted? Return to normalcy? I don't know what I want anymore. Oh, lordy, he chuckled to his wife. I think she'll be having an existential crisis or something. It certainly seems that way, said Jennifer. Goes a little late for that. Normalcy? Tabitha echoed. Is that what I'm after? Isn't it? I remember when we first moved in here, when the moving truck rumbled us past all those green trees, pastel houses cloistered up this dead-end street. It all seemed so plain, boring. We just moved out of the city. We looked at you guys and we mocked you. We didn't want to live a life of complacency. That wasn't why we got together, fell in love. We went to bed that night promising each other we'd never let the routine remold us. Why, you mocked us? An offended Jennifer Flatley said as bugs spewed forth from her excavated eye holes. I don't get it. What's wrong with us? Nothing, said Tabitha. Nothing is wrong with you. That was the point. You guys just seemed so normal. And the love I share with this guy, what's his name? It felt so different. I didn't want it to be normal. What's his name? Jennifer repeated. You guys remember his name? You guys remember him, don't you? It wasn't this worm fella you with, said Brad, motioning the handsome worm still seated next to them. It could be because most insects in most of my brains, Jennifer nodded, but as far as I can recall, I'm pretty sure you've always lived here with this worm man, your husband. No, Tabitha said, shaking her head. No, that's not right. He wasn't always a worm. He was a man once. She sighed and continued. I was so lost, lonely, at the end of my rope. I couldn't see anything beyond that day, the day that I met him. I was in the Home Depot. I was ready to... She paused, took a deep breath. And then, all of a sudden, there was this guy. He was there yesterday, wasn't there yesterday, and then all of a sudden, today he was. Our paths aligned, and that was it. We were entwined from there on out. It was an accident. This whole thing was an accident. Falling in love is an accident. It just happens. Happened, I should say. Past tense, because it had happened. We had fallen in love. And once we got there, it was like, what else? We took the same steps we saw people did before us. A wedding, a home, a job. We weren't special. Were we? Our love wasn't special. We were just like everyone else. So we grew comfortable with our lives, with each other, with everything. I wonder, is comfort the enemy of passion? Should people in love strive to stay uncomfortable? Is that the trick? Should we acknowledge how tenuous and fleeting our grasp on the future is? Should we set our houses on fire? Should we even have houses at all? And if we don't have houses, then where do we sleep? And if we can't sleep, then when do we dream? And if we're not dreaming, then where else do we have to go? And then, right there, as if jolted by an electric shock, she understood the reason that Harrison felt compelled to dig that hole. Harrison, Tabitha whispered to herself. That is his name. His name is Harrison. An escape hatch, a way out, something to hope for. He started digging the hole to try and save them, not to bury them in. She could see it now, as plain as the words in this paragraph. The way up was down, the way out was in. As above, so below. She threw herself out of the chair and onto the lawn. On her hands and knees, she crawled across the yard, blades of wispy dead grass scratching her skin, giving way slightly under the weight of her body. The neighbors watched silently. So did the worm man. She slithered her way to the center of the yard and found the spot where her husband first begun to dig. She herself was not a worm, but she moved with the dexterity of one as she struck her hands into the soil and pulled out a couple of large scoops. "The hole is still here!" she shouted. "The hole can be anywhere," Brad tried to rationalize with her. "All you have to do is dig, but it doesn't have to mean anything." She ignored him as she burrowed down, excavating just a few inches of dirt before coming across something that was buried in there. She pushed against it. It was firm and rubbery, like a car tire, but smaller. She brushed the earth from the top of it and stood up, wrapping her fingers around its sides. She pulled with all her might, and then it popped out of the ground and Tabitha fell backwards, landing on her butt. In her lap was a spleen fruit, purple and muscular, throbbing like it had its own heartbeat. "I hated that tree," she said. "It grew in our backyard, so creepy, like a big old hand trying to punch the sky. But here it is, innocent, just a shitty little fruit buried under the ground and forgotten. It hadn't begun to sprout yet. Even the biggest trees start out as the smallest seeds." She squeezed it. The rind turned from deep purple to lavender as it stretched against its steams before rupturing open. White ovular seeds squirted out an efflux of clear fluid. It ejected itself all over Tabitha's sunflower dress, the smell of rancid meat wafting up from the goop. In another state of mind, Tabitha might have gagged, dry-heaved, turned her head and ran as fast and as far as she could from this vile situation. But here, in this moment, she didn't even wince. Instead, she plucked a singular seed from the seminal slop, held it up. It glistened and quivered in her trembling hands. Then she put it in her mouth and swallowed it. "Disgusting," Jennifer Flatter remarked as her brains leaked out of her nose and ears, and pieces of her scalp fell off in wet clumps, and bugs climbed in and out of the gory, open wounds covering her pallid and dehydrated flesh. 20. Now we skip ahead a few hours. Brad and Jennifer Flatley had already said their goodbyes, shambled their ghostly corpses back to the tomb of their own home. "Hey, Tabitha," Brad said right before he left. "I'm not quite sure what you're searching for, what the point of any of this really is, but I hope you figure it all out." And that was the last we're going to hear from the Flatleys, or at least for the rest of this book. So long, and thanks for the exposition, you two. And then it was later that night, past midnight, or rather it would have been past midnight, if this were the kind of place that could disseminate between day and night. But as it were, it was always night down here, this city, and by extension, this odd version of Sycamore Lane. Tabitha suddenly woke up from a deep slumber. She could hear the worm man stirring slightly underneath the top of their bed. But he didn't even poke his head out as she stood up, made her way out of the room, down the hallway, down the stairs, and out into the backyard. Reality felt firm as a wet piece of silk. Her thoughts were as concrete as the air itself. Here she stood, in her nightgown, guts twisting and turning inside her stomach as the spleen fruit seeds sprouted and took hold. The roots plucked her veins like a guitar and strung up her sinews like they'd been sent to the gallows. And were this seed able to talk to her like a child talking to a tin can telephone, she would have heard repeating the same message over and over and over again. To the shed! Go to the shed! So she did. Here she found the collection of tools her husband had left, stored in the cramped shed's dustiest corners. Screwdrivers and pliers and power drills and saws, either hanging on the walls or stashed away in boxes or shelves. Nothing's broken, she had said to Harrison on the day she bought all the useless hardware. Aren't you going to feel stupid when you realize you spent all this money on, say, that shop saw right there and you never use it? To which he simply replied, Darling, you never know what tool you're going to need until the moment you need it. She reached out and picked up an axe. She cut back across the yard, dragging the axe through the yellow grass behind her. It was heavier than she would have guessed. Back up the stairs, in the hallway in front of the spare room. She turned the handle one last time, jiggled and jerked it, locked as ever was. And then she took the axe and slammed it into the door. Hey, remember that scene in The Shining where Jack Torrance is swinging that axe at the bathroom door, smashed up with little lace pieces, and he pokes his head through and says, Here's Johnny, as his terrified family screams and cries. This moment was just like that, except there's no terrified family on the other side of the room. Terrified person was the one wielding the axe. Felt like fireworks inside her head, a cannonade, a firestorm exploding across her synapses. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and her spine felt like it was twisted up with her veins, the spleen fruit growing inside of her, clawing apart her veins. Her arms burned with every strike. She screamed, primal. It was coming out of her like lava from the lips of a volcano. Oh God, these walls, these suffocating walls. This isn't her house. Whose house is this? Where the fuck was she? And the door splintered apart, fell in jagged wooden pieces, and she stepped through it. Here is what the spare room looked like. There was a throw rug in the center of the floor, pastel and soft against her bare feet. It was clean, freshly vacuumed, swept, and sterilized. A crib was pushed in the far corner, the wood on the bars polished and new like it's been assembled. From the window, light spilled in. Daylight. Summer night light. Like it was a June afternoon outside. Tabitha scarcely had time to contemplate the logistical impossibility of this, how the sun might be shining in this one room, only from a sky which has no sun, when she saw the walls. The color. After spending years upon years, buckets upon buckets, coats upon coats, she had needlessly and endlessly toiled for this stupid room, and now here it was, without any of her help, needing to be repainted no more, complete. It was the perfect color. Language completely failed her. She was speechless, in awe. It was not simply a combination of this much red and that much blue, because that would have just been a new shade of purple, and purple was just fucking purple after all. You know what purple looks like. Purple can be explained. No. Language failed this color because it contradicted the eye to even see. It was a color, and yet it wasn't. Matte yet bright in defiance of rainbows. We could call it Urta work, or Boo Dirt, or Malagrin, or whatever the hell made up word you wanted. It doesn't matter. Because it was all nonsense at this point anyway. How would you even begin to describe what something called Malargin looks like anyway? The axe slipped from her hand and she fell to her knees, palms up, eyes moist. It felt like madness roaring through her head. Before, now shifted into who knows what? There were too many damn motions to be able to name them all, if they even had names to begin with. Just like the color on the walls of this room, her feelings were a blur heretofore unknowable. And then, the mobile spun like a mobile above the crib spun, all by itself. It was so spooky, just like in a horror movie. Not The Shining this time, a different horror movie. The mobile was made up of 3 plastic beetles, clear fishing line affixed to a small loop on their backs, wings out like they were in the midst of flight. They moved in a slow, tight circle as creepy tink-ting lullaby music played. Tabitha dried her eyes, sniffled up her snot, got a grip on herself, looked towards the revolving mobile like it were the clock ticking down the side of a time bomb. She stood up, toes back in the carpet pointed toward the crib, and the closer she stepped in that direction, the darker got outside. The sun, or whatever it was, disappeared like someone had lowered the temperature on the knob. Grayness took its place. Decay crept in. It overcame those perfectly painted walls. The room got cold. The sound that the mobile made was so fucking evil. Holy shit. She placed her hands on the edge of the crib and slowly peeked inside, and there was nothing there. She let out a sigh of relief. She expected something gross, something terrifying, an alien bug baby or something, but nope. She turned to leave the room, and that's when the worm man attacked her. 21. All at once he was on top of her, wrapping his slender body around her like a bungee cord. He pulled taut, and the wind was forced out of her lungs. He twisted like a pretzel around her ankles. She tried to run, but he tripped her up. She fell. As soft as the rug it appeared to be before, there was still wood underneath it, and that wood was hard. And when she landed on it cheek first, it hurt, like thud. And then there was a red line crisscrossed in her face where the skin had split, and the worm man was wrapping himself around her tighter, and the blood in her chest was squeezed up to her head, squirting out of the wound like melted ice cream. It puddled underneath her and clotted in her hair. She couldn't move. All of this happened so quickly that she didn't even have the chance to scream, until the worm was already knotted up around all her limbs, and his pointy, expressionless face was hovering menacingly just a few inches above hers. "Help!" she cried as loud as she could, which wasn't very loud at all. Certainly not loud enough for anyone to do anything about. The plea that escaped her lips was no more a scream than a float. With a flat tie was a parade. "Someone please help!" Tabitha was lying powerless on the floor of the room she had painted and repainted 1,000 times before, and the monster on top of her in complete control. She was crying for help, like somebody would actually come in and save her. Like the word help meant anything down here under the ground. Like help was even an option anymore. No, you're not going to see the Flatleys come bursting through the door, their empty bones jangling across the room as they pulled the assailing worm off her in the nick of time, and then the 3 of them sconding away down the road, all safe and sound forevermore. And you're certainly not going to see Harrison Moss suddenly come smashing through the window pane, land in front of him in a hurricane of shattered glass, 2 bandoliers of ammo strapped around his somehow non-muscular chest, finger on the trigger of a semi-automatic rifle, unloading a volley of bullets into this aggravated annelid like he was Arnold Schwarzenegger, taking down the bad guys of the Climax Commando. Neither of these things were going to happen. Instead, we have this. The worm forced her legs wide open and pressed his body against the skin of her thighs. Her wide eyes rolled over the crib, then back to him. "Why?" she eked. Everything had gone blurry. He was secreting something oozy and thick and white, covering her rigid flesh. It was coming out of his skin in pearly globs. It was worm cum. He was coming all over the place, lubricating them both. It smelled foul, and Tabitha got sick. Vomit and blood pouring out of her face, swirling together, sloshing around underneath them, swirled up like the colors in a peppermint candy. He held her down. Her dress slipped past her eyes and up to her waist. Her chest heaved in and out, hyperventilating. She was suffocating her own body. The worm man took it slower and shoved it right between her legs. Tabitha yelped and futilely thrashed. Here were the worm man's ultimate intentions. It was going to enter her. He was going to climb inside of her skin. He was going to make her pregnant with him. He was going to infest her, live inside her, wear her like a suit, become her. And then when he was done, he would give birth back to himself. He was going to consume her in her totality, gnawing away from the inside out. He was going to eat her past, present, and future, give it back to the dirt, because to a worm, a human body isn't worth more than the mud it had been created from. He was going to fuck her up. He was going to fuck her. But he couldn't. And not for lack of will, and he certainly tried. No, he couldn't fuck her up because there was nothing there for him to fuck. There was nothing between her legs but a flat patch of skin, like the inner part of an elbow. She was a Barbie doll beneath her skirt. She had no vagina. She had nothing at all. She had known this, of course, as did you, the reader, because it had been discussed before. She had willingly let her genitals disappear, a physical manifestation of her turmoil. Any trace of passion she had held on to before, stolen away by apathy over the years. She had let that apathy in, let it metastasize, let it take over. She let it claim her relationship, claim her womanhood, claim her life. And it dawned on Tabitha right then as the worm man's lower half forced itself in the space between her hips, pressing against the flat spot, searching in vain for an opening he expected to be there, that her body was not his to take or to exploit. He would not be able to assert himself over her if she didn't let him, for he possessed no real power. He was just a parasite after all, and she was a human being. She had chosen this life. She had willed her pussy away. She had brought herself here to this fake house, constructed to be a poor facsimile of the real thing. And if she wanted to leave, all she had to do was get up and go. The worm man's head cocked to the side. You think that will stop us? You think we can find another way into your skin? You are nothing but a nest, Tabitha. An incubator that thinks its life means something more. You are nothing but meat. These words materialized in her head, intruded in from the ether, pushing out all her other thoughts. She grit her teeth and exhaled loudly, searching for that voice in her brain she recognized as her own. Even if I can't stop you. Tabitha Moss grunted aloud at the creature on top of her as she reached over and grabbed the handle of the axe in her right hand. I can certainly try. She swung the weapon in the worm man's back. He unraveled immediately, untangling himself from her, reeling back, his injured body like a bullwhip thrashing around. Tabitha dodged his wild swings as he tried to escape, slithering on his belly towards the exit. But Tabitha, quickly back on her feet, determinedly walked over to the creature. She stepped on its tail and pulled the axe out of his back. He writhed in pain. The fluid he'd been secreting earlier had turned from white to pink. He turned around to face her, helpless, pleading. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust, motherfucker, she said, a line sheet enough to be spoken by Arnold Schwarzenegger himself as she swung down with all her might, chopping the worm man completely in half. His two halves wriggled, bled, and stopped wriggling. She took off down the stairs and out the front door. She ran down the street, away from the cul-de-sac. In the distance, the volcano softly rumbled. 22. On the floor of a warehouse rave, Harrison Moss was lying too, held to the ground at the mercy of this seductive and vicious worm-woman on top of him. He was not as strong as his wife. That should have been established long ago. He had let the madness in early. It could be argued that he was the one who pulled her into this madness with him, and that Tabitha was and remained an innocent bystander, merely trying to cope with the desperate whims of an obsessive and unhinged man. But to argue that would be selling her short as a character, depriving her of an arc in which she can learn and grow as a person, as surely Harrison's about to do in the most disgusting and bizarre way. Note: interpretations as to the intent of the author in regards to some of the more metaphorical aspects of the story may vary depending on your personal experience and biases. The point remains that whereas Tabitha was able to find off her assailant off and escape, Harrison hadn't had this revelation until it was too late. So here's what happened. The worm woman entered his mouth, forcing her way down his throat. She filled him like the spleen fruit had. He could feel her sticky figure as it pushed its way further and further into him, into his stomach, his bowels, the curves of her body that he once thought were sexy, now pushed against the underside of his skin like the water in a balloon that was leaving to burst. He was a blood balloon that was going to explode. He was eating up his insides. If you're unaware of the roles that worms play, ecologically speaking, allow me to elaborate. I know you're not supposed to go off on too many tangents, especially when the action is rising, such as now, as the wormwoman burrows where our protagonist's guts, but it's important to the story. Just trust me, okay? Worms eat decaying organic matter, leaves and manure and other detritus. They eat up and digest the dirt, which in turn helps to aerate it, improving its fertility. Healthy soil is a necessary part of a sustainable ecological system. Of course, Harrison had lungs, which he could breathe from, and he didn't need to be aerated. Still, the wormwoman ate. His internal organs passed through her as it would pass through all worms, maw to belly and beyond, until it eventually excreted out the other end. This substance was called vermicompost, or more colloquially, worm shit. Worms eat old soil and shit out nutrient-rich soil in its place. This was the kind of soil that aided plant growth. The kind of soil, let's say, in which the seed of a spleen fruit tree might finally grow the kind of purchase it needed to vibrantly, terrifyingly grow. The worm woman was eating Harrison up from the inside out and filling his body with her shit. And the spleen fruit seed he had swallowed all the way back at the beginning of this book, the spleen fruit tree that had squeezed his veins and seized his brains, it grew quickly, rapidly, way more rapidly than before, finding all the nourishment it could possibly need in the now abundant mulch that his innards had become. The spleen fruit bore its roots deep into his flesh. She traveled all the way through him, evacuating herself out of his body in the same way the dirt was evacuating hers. The bottom. She came out of his asshole covered in shit and slime, filth and blood. Harrison convulsed on the dance floor while the wormwoman smugly coiled above him. Brown foam poured out of his mouth, spilling down his cheeks, his eyes wide, gagging. And then came the leaves. They sprouted on the top of his tongue and sprung from every cut on his body. A bouquet. A goddamn forest coming out of him. He had been fertilized. What did you do? He said as he stood up. A lungful of mulch spilled out of his face every time he opened his mouth. He could feel it like mucus inside his body, the vegetation proliferating faster than he could possibly expunge it. And then he spoke. It pushed its way past its lips and garbled up his words so that he ended up choking on marbles. The worm woman was smiling. Well, not literally smiling, but the worm equivalent to smiling, which to the untrained eye looked like nothing. She couldn't smile. Her physiology was incapable of it, but Harrison could sense it. He knew she was smiling, just like he knew that this was what she would be saying if she had a voice. You are my house. You are my dirt. You are my everything, Harrison Moss. You are my planet. Those words were the words that formed delicately inside his head. What are you talking about? He shouted. What does that mean? That was a little vague, wasn't it? Should I rewrite that line? Who would even say something like that? Like, what does it mean? See, even the narrator is mocking you, he said to the wormwoman, pointing to the paragraph before this one. She remained unfazed, as his skin pulsated out in bubbles like his insides were boiling. It hurt. Why are you doing all this to me? He shouted at the entire room, all the other insects watching from the balconies and the building's wings. What is the point of trying to get the bottom of things when the answers we uncover are even more convoluted than the questions we ask? What did you whisper in my head? Better question is, why'd you swallow the seed in the first place? I don't know, he said. More leaves shot out of his mouth. They were growing out of his ears and nose. All around the edges of his eyelids, wispy roots hung like corn silk. Potato roots spread across his face like acne. I don't know why I swallowed it, okay? I don't know what was wrong with me. I don't know why I don't know how to be happy. He took a laborious and exasperated breath. I tried to fight it, to deny the apathy, access to the footholds it had slowly carved into my life, but I gave up. That's how it wins. We eventually get tired of trying to stop it. Because there is no stopping it. I hate to see it because what else was I gonna do? When I pulled my wife down with me, and I didn't know if she was ready for that, but I was desperate. I pulled her into this hole, and now I'm turning into a fucking plant, and she's gone. He looked at the worm woman. If he could have cried, he would have, but the roots inside his body drank up all his tears before he could squelch them out. It's too late to stop this, isn't it? The worm woman didn't respond, didn't move. She just stood there, motionless, her body shaped like a crooked S. The shadows from the darkest parts of the club crept up to meet her, to take her away. "Wait, where are you going?" he said. There was panic in his voice. He knew that once she left, she was never coming back. This was the wicked way of love. It cut through your life with remorse, sometimes flourishing, sometimes ravishing. Harrison was the dirt in which these buds would bloom, and in the end he'd be buried. His body was her vessel, and now she was leaving. Her work here was done. His shoes had broken open as roots pushed themselves out of the ends of his toes and made their way for the ground below. He had to keep moving his legs up and down to keep from getting stuck. "You can't leave me here in this place. I'm a man, not a plant. You can just rip me apart my insides and disappear. That's not fair. None of this works." She said nothing. Like the apparition she appeared to be the first time. He saw her, the thought form edge of perception that all memories take. She once again fell into the shadows. He had no one to blame but himself, of course. He had followed this road to its deadest of ends. Just like the house in the cul-de-sac of Sycamore Lane, he had nowhere left to go. He looked up at the worm woman. She was almost gone, completely. Faded away forever. There was only one thing left that he could possibly do to stop her. He took a breath. His lungs full of flowers, and he charged, screaming into the darkness. He leapt on her. She tumbled backwards, letting a shocked hiss. When her maw opened, he saw teeth, sharp like a shark's. Pulled her out of the shadows and threw her back on the dance floor. "I don't know what you are, what you're supposed to be. I won't let you go that easy," screamed. Other club were gone, eerily silent. The colored lights and strobes still flashed, adding a circus-like quality to the melee. The DJ, a slug named MC Saltshaker, why not, sensed this and played some circus-like music to accompany the scene. You see this in your head? It was like a fucking circus, and I know circus is supposed to be fun, but... He was straddling her, the worm woman thrashing about under him, trying to free herself to no avail. For the first time in a long time, he had the upper hand. You get it? The upper hand. I didn't even have hands. Irony? See, it is kind of fun, right? He shoved his shovel hand down as hard as he could, swinging it with the precision of a guillotine, striking her in the center of her torso. The edges of the shovel had been wet from all the miles of digging he had done, so as he sheened and sharp as a bowie knife, and it sliced right through her, like she was nothing more than jello. The force of his blow drove the trowel through her entire body, chopped her in two. It came out of her back in an explosion of white worm guts and embedded itself into the concrete floor, wedging itself tighter than the sword of Excalibur. Her two halves wriggled about, desperate for escape, before finally throwing Harrison off and, in the process, ripping the shovel hand from his body. Didn't want to come off, not easily, after being fused with his arm bones, but the force was such that it came off anyway in a geyser of hot blood and brown foliage, his wrist torn open. But he didn't remain handless for long. The plant inside him rushed from the opening, replacing his missing extremity. Long, bark-covered branches crawled out of the wound, 5 branches, one for each finger. They hung, a dozen inches each, twisty digits that were barely functional. He could flex his muscle and get them to twitch, but that was about it. He wasn't playing the piano or painting the Sistine Chapel with these fingers. He wasn't going to be doing much of anything, except running for the exit to the club, running as fast as his tree-trunk legs could carry him, out into the world. End of part 2.